Cool. Okay. I affirm the resolution that the EU should automatically offer membership to any state that successfully secedes from a current or former EU member state. So we define secede as leave a state. So if there's like a rebellion in Hungary, for example, they make their own nation state, and that nation state would automatically be offered membership to the European Union. And to clarify and just illustrate what membership of the EU actually looks like, this includes things like free trade with all European Union members. It means open borders for travel between those states, like you have an EU passport, basically. And you also get very easy access to all universities and education in the EU. So if you're living in Germany, it's really easy for you to go to school in France, for example. Okay, so we have one major contention, and it is that the EU offering membership to any state that successfully secedes from the EU will allow liberation for people in oppressive regimes. So, I don't know if that was like a raise hand, but if you have a POI, just say it out loud, by the way. Okay. First, what we can see in the status quo is that Hungary and Poland, both EU member states, are extremely oppressive. First, let's look at Poland. Recently, a town in Poland just voted to be free of LGBT, meaning that anybody engaging in homosexual activity or something that seemed as if it was homosexual activity would be able to be legally prosecuted. They also have enacted a nationwide complete ban on abortion. The parliament in Poland has a ton of jurisdiction over the courts, basically meaning the courts are not autonomous, and the people who are prosecuted in court is kind of entirely up to the Polish government. And they kind of have the right to assembly. However, people are being arrested and giving extremely long sentences for protesting the government in Poland right now. Next, let's look at Hungary. So in Hungary, there's a ton of discrimination against women, transgender people, and the Muslim and Roma population specifically. So Hungary actually came out and said that they refused to combat the violence against women that was going on in Hungary. Women are extremely vulnerable over there. If you are transgender and you live in Hungary, it is basically impossible for you to live that out. You cannot get gender affirming anything, and you also will not be legally recognized, and you may be penalized for associating yourself with the transgender identity. And lastly, the Muslim and Roma population are heavily discriminated against. They face a lot of police brutality, and they are just generally not welcome in the nation of Hungary. Furthermore, just like Poland, people can't really peacefully assemble there. And lastly, and secondly, neither of these countries are really a democracy, or the democracy is super messed up. So there's not really a way that the people in these states can gain freedom through government systems, through voting, etc. So yeah. Thirdly, in the status quo, often states that do cede cripple. This is due to the fact that they have no economic support from the country that they ceded from and from all of its allies. So again, example of Hungary, if a state ceded from Hungary, without this plan and in the status quo, they would basically be blacklisted from trading with Hungary and from trading with any of Hungary's allies. And this is a major disincentive to attempt secession for marginalized people, because they just think that their attempted secession will fail and lead to even worse quality of life. However, under the plan, what happens? The first thing, obviously, is that a nation state secedes and it has the EU's support. Secondly, is that this will allow for this country to have the potential for a good economy, which is probably the most essential thing for the longevity and for the quality of life of people in this nation state. This is for multiple reasons. The first being that trade is possible because it eliminates the trade barriers that would normally exist from the state that they ceded from, because both would be a part of the EU, and any allies of Hungary or whatever in the EU would still have to put in free trade with this country. Secondly, the EU could help the economy of this ceded state. The EU usually wants to be seen as a very stable and powerful entity, so they do their best to support countries within the EU to make them seem as stable as possible. Furthermore, progressive countries like Germany, for example, they want to provide help to marginalized people, specifically in Poland and Hungary, and if a country secedes, they could show that support by providing support to the marginalized people in that seceded state. The third reason why it would help the economy is that people can get a good education from, countries like France, countries from Germany, those universities. So if a country cedes from Poland or whatever, they don't really have any good universities or educational institutions. They can easily use the educational options that exist in Germany, in France, etc. And this will eventually create a more prosperous state because education is essential for innovation, for economic prosperity in general. The fourth reason why it would help the economy is that it would allow people to get essential goods from other EU countries through trade without the burden of tariffs or sanctions. So this means that essential goods that they're importing from France are not going to be extremely expensive. It means that the manufacturing parts that they're importing from Germany, for example, are not going to be incredibly expensive and cripple any efforts of, entrepreneurship in those countries. The fifth reason why it would help the economy is that it would incentivize tourism to this place because of the EU passport thing. So if this place has really good beaches or something, people are more likely to go and visit them from the EU because they have the EU passport and it's fairly easy to go visit there. And so the third thing that would happen overall is that people in Hungary and Poland are more likely to secede if they find it necessary because they know that they will have the support from the EU and they know that their nation state is not going to fail. So the impacts of this are we will see a higher quality of life for marginalized people in these countries. They will not have to be living under the oppressive regimes that they are now anymore under the plan. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to be just on a quick off-time roadmap here, beginning with a clarifying point for our case. Then I'm going to go quickly down through our case, the opposition case, and then I'm going to go through and rebut the government contention. So with that, if everybody's ready. Okay, I will start my time now. Okay, first off, just beginning with this kind of clarifying point in regards to the actual status quo, effectively the policy of the opposition that we're defending here. There is no standing policy that the EU blanket rejects those who secede from member states. The current policy is effectively those who secede from member states are considered for membership were they to apply. So in the current situation, there is no rule of if you secede, you are automatically barred or automatically discluded from membership. The current situation is those who secede are considered, but just like any other country, they are considered. They may be accepted, they may not. Now with that, I want to get into our contentions very quickly, and that's going to come up a lot in the third contention, just to forewarn a bit. So anyway, our first contention is about animosity in the EU. Most of the reason that the EU's both trade and international relations formats are able to work and are able to work as well as they do has to do with international cooperation and has to do with the nations getting along, with the nations cooperating together. Were there to be either violent or non-violent, but a secession that one nation was not happy about, this would then create a large amount of animosity within the EU and could potentially lead to division of almost factions where some people would side with the seceded state, others would side with the original state, and we would effectively see a large division between the EU. This would be horrible for basically every member state of the EU, as well as for the EU as a whole. And more so, this could lead to just broader worldwide conflict, as potentially these two factions could end up getting into some degree of conflict, be it economic or military. And this could obviously, as I'll talk about later, lead to secession from the EU. Anyway, in our second contention, this increases the overall amount of violent secession. I'm going to explain later why, in terms of the situations that they're talking about, of people being horribly, horribly oppressed and horribly, horribly mistreated, they will secede anyway. Their policy has no solvency to increase the rates rates of secession among those who are being horribly, horribly mistreated. But what this will do is it will take regions who are not being mistreated and want to secede simply for their own political or economic gain and massively increase their likelihood of seceding. So there's a lot of potential impacts there. One, there's just going to be a lot more conflict and death as we see more violent secessions, which leads to more war, more armed conflict, and with it, obviously, more death. More so, we will see potentially terrorism join, or terrorist states joining the EU, as it would be very easy for some terrorist faction to violently secede from a member of the EU and then be granted automatic membership. Now, right now, if you were someone who is being massively abused for being part of the LGBTQ population and you were to secede, you would almost definitely, and I'll give examples later, but you would almost definitely still be accepted. You would almost definitely still be granted EU membership. The only difference here is if you were some terrorist faction who decided to secede simply because they wanted to be, have more control over their own laws and wanted more ability to exercise their terrorist goals, they would likely be rejected. So again, just to clarify here, we're not saying that we're automatically barring all seceded states. We're defending the status quo, which is if you secede, you are considered. You may be accepted, you may not be, depending on how violent your secession was, how just your secession was, are you terrorists or not? All this would be taken into account rather than just an automatic policy of you're automatically in. And more so in the second contention, we say just secession is overall bad for nations and general economies. Again, in the cases where these secessions are just and necessary, as they're telling you, in cases where people are being abused for being LGBTQ or anything else like that, these secessions will still happen at an equal frequency in both worlds, and these seceding states will be equally likely to be accepted into the EU. The only real difference we're going to see is when we're talking about people who have very little just reason and are seceding violently, we're going to decrease the likelihood of that. And those secessions are bad not only because they cause death and conflict, but also they cause economic division between nations. They overall damage the economy of the country. They hurt individual people on a high level. Moving into our third contention, peaceful secessions and those with reasons to secede are almost always granted. So when Greenland seceded and developed some semblance of independence, they were granted EU membership because they seceded peacefully and because they seceded with just reason. And this happens frequently, that if a country secedes peacefully with just reasons, they are granted EU membership. So there's no massive disincentive of, oh, well, if we secede, we're not going to be granted EU membership. It's only if we secede without reason and if we secede violently that we won't be granted EU membership. So what we're really seeing is there will be no change, and I'll talk about this on their case, but there will be no change in the number of just and peaceful secessions. All that we will see is a large increase in violent secessions. Now, in our fourth contention, this complicates the Common Security and Defense Pact that the EU has. The EU has a Common Security and Defense Pact where they all agree to defend each other. This leads to these weird gray areas where if there's, some kind of insurrection or some kind of uprising of rebels attacking a country, normally the EU would defend their member state from this insurrection and from this, violent armed insurrection. But in a scenario where they're being told that they have to automatically grant membership to these people if they secede, there's almost this gray area of, well, do we have a right to step in? Do we have a right to protect these people from this insurrection? Which leads to more violent insurrections happening and more violent insurrections going unchecked, which again, as we've told you before, leads to a large increase in warfare, a large increase in conflict, and a large increase of death. And then finally, in our fifth contention, it's actually more likely that the secessionists will be further oppressed, because if you are a country who knows that if you let them succeed, if they succeed in seceding, that's tough to say, if they succeed in seceding, that they will automatically be granted membership to the EU, you are far more likely to try to fight that secession. If you think if they secede, they'll automatically be an EU member, and you want to maintain your power in the European Union, you want to maintain your place in the European Union, you're far more likely to use force and oppressive force to suppress these these secessionists, to try to prevent them from leaving and to try to prevent them from successfully seceding. But in our world, since it's only a consideration policy, they will be far more likely to not take this oppressive force because they'll think there's a way to block them without actually going through this. Now, going over to the government case here and going through the government contention, I'm just going to kind of address this subpoint by subpoint. First off, they talk about how they talk about places where people are extremely discriminated against. They talk about Poland. What we firmly believe is, one, given that there's an extremely high likelihood if these people were to secede due to this mistreatment, that they would be granted membership, and two, due to just the fact that they are being grossly and horribly mistreated, this is going to have little to no bearing on whether or not these people secede. If you're being oppressed and suppressed for who you are, beaten and attacked for who you are, and you think there's still a very, very high likelihood that if you secede, you'll be granted EU membership, the fact that now it's a guarantee versus a high percentage, this isn't going to be the decision-making factor. When you're deciding to secede, the question isn't, will I still be an EU member? The question is, like, can I live if I remain in this country? How can I sustain this discrimination? How can I live through this discrimination and everything I'm facing? That's the priority one. They're not saying, oh, well, will we still be EU members? That might be a very, very small decision further down on their list, but that's not the deciding factor on whether to secede. And given that it's going from 100% chance of acceptance in the EU to a 98% or some very small difference, this is going to have absolutely no difference in the number of discriminated people seceding. More so, they talk about how nations can be crippled if they're not members. This doesn't really hold up very well, that their economy would be crippled if they're not members, because they can still trade with people like the US and the EU. They talk later about how they need essential goods, the US and China. They talk later about how they need essential goods from places in the EU and they can't be charged with tariffs. But the fact of the matter is, if they're an EU member, they have to charge tariffs on goods from the US and China, which are the two largest economies in the world. If they're not an EU member, they can work out trade deals where they will be getting US and Chinese goods with little to no tariffs. So it will actually be better for their economy in the long run not to be EU members. My partner will address a lot of this later because I'm running out of time, but even on this point of education, American citizens, people who aren't EU members, can attend universities in the EU, so that's pretty irrelevant. They'll still be able to attend these EU universities, and my partner will respond to the rest of these subpoints later as I'm out of time, but I strongly urge a ballot for the opposition, and thank you all for your time.
Okay, I'm Kai Taigen. I'm the second speaker for the government. I'd need just a second to set up my timer and my flow. Real quick, if you do have a point of information, I will be using a separate sheet for my flow, so please say something out loud. Otherwise, I won't notice you doing a POI. Okay, so I will start my time now. Okay, so let's start on the opposition case. We're going to talk about the points of clash in this debate. Now, they first start with a general observation. They say there's no policy that says that the EU will reject people who cede. These countries will be considered, and in cases where it is a peaceful, reasonable secession, such as in Poland, such as in Hungary, it will get through and they will be voted into the EU easily. They will be accepted to the EU. I want to point out things are different in the EU now. The EU, decisions like this are made by unanimous decision inside of the EU. And the fact of the matter is Poland and Hungary, or other oppressive states, can vote down efforts to admit these seceding states into the EU. They've been stonewalling the EU decision body plenty before. They tried to stonewall the EU when the EU was talking about maybe revoking their membership for human rights abuses. And they'll do the same thing for these countries. If Poland loses a bunch of its citizens and a bunch of its economy to a secession state, it is naturally going to vote against that state joining the EU, joining the economic bloc. So the idea that, there's a 98% chance that these countries will be admitted to the EU simply doesn't make sense. And their examples really have nothing to do with the actual situation right now. Okay, so let's move down to contention 1. Okay, so on contention 1, we see that they say this is going to create animosity within the EU. And they say the reason the EU works is because of international cooperation. If you secede, there will be division within the EU. And they're basically painting a picture where in the status quo, there is no division inside of the EU. The fact of the matter is there is, in fact, already animosity. Like we said earlier, there's a lot of international tension between conservative governments like Poland and Hungary and the rest of the EU, which is for the most part fairly progressive, right? So the idea that, you're going to create factions that's going to shut down the entire EU, the fact of the matter is there are already factions between repressive governments and between governments that support free and fair democracy. This is already happening in the status quo. So the idea that you're only going to create animosity when you provide an opportunity for freedom to poor and oppressed people whose side government agrees are in fact oppressed simply doesn't make sense. Now, the next point they make is that this is going to increase violent secession, right? They say that violent secessionist groups like terrorist groups that do not have any real legitimate reason to secede and are just seceding for power, are more likely to secede if they know that they'll get a blanket acceptance to the EU, and that there's going to be no real change in how likely it is for peaceful states seceding from Hungary and Poland to be accepted to the EU. Again, we have already refuted that point by saying that effort would be voted down. In terms of terrorist states or just bad state actors joining the EU, while this is a blanket policy, you can in fact revoke that state from the EU. Poland and Hungary have been able to support each other, but generally when a country has just seceded, it has no real allies. It will not have the same international backing as Poland and Hungary to be able to stonewall votes within the EU. The membership can be revoked if they are clearly a bad member state. And also the last thing is never mind. So the next point they make, again, is that peaceful secession is almost always granted. They cite the example of Greenland, which I believe was seceding from Denmark, right? So in the case of Greenland seceding from Denmark, if I'm correct about this, Denmark is nowhere near as repressive or authoritarian a government as Hungary or Poland. And at the time, there was not nearly as much political stonewalling going on within the EU. So this is from a different time with different countries. Poland and Hungary will definitely block the votes to get these countries into the EU, to get peaceful seceding countries going away from them into the EU. Then the last point they make on their case, or one of the last points they make, is the point about a defensive pact, how the EU has a defense pact. It's like a military alliance. I want to point out this really isn't true. The EU is very specifically not a military alliance. It was formed after World War II when people were very, very careful about military alliances, when they were worried about this. The EU is an economic bloc. Now, yes, it may defend other countries if there's like a mainland invasion from some outside foreign power, right? But in terms of an insurrection, the EU has historically not stepped in to be on one side or the other because, again, the EU is not a military alliance. It is very, very specifically an economic bloc, right? And the fact of the matter is, no, sorry. Okay, I'm gonna keep moving down. They talk again about countries are more likely to. Oh, this is their last point. Sorry, their last contention is that countries like Hungary and Poland are more likely to fight secession movements if they know that that country will become an EU member, right? This really doesn't make sense. It's not very warranted. Let's think about this from Hungary or Poland's perspective, right? Let's say you're Hungary and Poland, and now suddenly a big chunk of your population, a big chunk of your economy is leaving. It's going off to form its own state with ideals that you do not support, right? Now, regardless of whether it is inside of your common market, inside of your economic bloc, the EU, you're going to crack down on that no matter what. They're already cracking down on these types of movements. They're already cracking down on peaceful protesters. There's nothing left to lose at this point. Poland and Hungary have already shown they're willing to take really any measure to be as repressive as possible, and there's no reason why they would decide to be more repressive and have more incentive to be repressive if they knew that the country would join the EU, because again, Poland and Hungary, the big thing for them is that they don't want countries to leave them, period, regardless of whether or not they're in the EU market. Let's move on to side government's case. Okay, so on our point about how Hungary and Poland are oppressive, how people need to be able to create secession states from Hungary and Poland, again, they say there's a high likelihood that these countries would be granted EU membership anyway without a blanket policy. Again, this ignores the simple political reality that this type of thing can be voted down by Hungary or Poland or both. They guarantee a high percentage versus, an absolute 100% guarantee. They say there's no real difference, but it's not 98% versus 100%. It's like 2 or 3% because that's the chance that Poland or Hungary will somehow decide not to vote down admitting a member to the EU versus an actual blanket policy that will make sure they're let in no matter what bad state actors like Hungary and Poland think.
Hi.
Yes.
It's not just Hungary and Poland that could vote down this state. It could be any other state and any other country that they make a deal with in order to coerce.
Hungary and Poland can also strike deals within the EU with their friends to make sure that these types of things are voted down. Hungary and Poland have plenty of political power to make sure that countries cannot actually successfully secede if you're going through the regular voting process, instead of implementing the government plan to have a blanket policy of making sure that states are always admitted to the EU. Now, the next point that they make is that it doesn't really matter if a country is able to trade with the EU because it can trade with the United States or China, which are the two biggest economies in the world, right? I want to point out in the specific examples of Hungary and Poland, these are both landlocked countries in Eastern Europe, not easy for them to trade with the United States and China, which are all the way overseas powers, right? Furthermore, the extreme regional proximity of the EU makes it a very, very valuable trading partner. We've seen throughout history that it's very valuable to be in these regional blocs, such as our relationship with Canada and Mexico, or the relationship between Southeast Asian countries in Asia, right? So there is, in fact, an extreme detriment to not being able to trade with the EU, which side government actually admits would happen if we didn't implement our plan to let them into the EU, right? And the idea that China and the US are feasible alternatives simply ignores the geographical reality of Hungary and Poland. It's a lot harder to trade with these overseas countries, especially when you're landlocked. They say that, in terms of education for citizens from these new seceding countries, they can just go, or that there's no real difference between countries in the EU being able to easily go to college in other countries within the EU and countries outside of the EU having access to that education. The fact of the matter is this simply isn't true. They say, American students can study in Europe. Yes, that's true, but it's a lot harder. There's a lot more roadblocks to make sure that it doesn't happen. If you're part of the EU, it is a lot easier to travel to those countries, to be educated in those countries, and to have that type of educational support so that the new secessionist country can get back on its feet. So what should you take away? There is no guarantee without this blanket policy that peaceful secessionist states would be able to actually join the EU. It would be voted down by Hungary and Poland, and you need the blanket policy to protect progressive movements, which side government agrees are necessary in Hungary and Poland. For all these reasons, I urge a strong vote for side government. Sorry, I've been calling them side government, they're side opposition. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, hey everyone. 1 second. Okay. I'm going to start off with a really brief off-time roadmap. I'm going to start off with a point on the top of the case. Then I will go through my own contentions, then I'll go through my opponent's contentions. Is everyone ready? Yep. Okay. I'll start my time in 3, 2,
Wait, sorry,
1.
can I have 1 sec? My timer just got messed up.
Sure. Jack, are you good?
Yeah, sorry, I just started it wrong. Yeah, I'm good now, thanks.
Okay. I'll start my time in 3, 2, 1. One of the most important points in this round is where we talk about whether or not these peaceful countries that like secede are still going to get into the EU or not. And I tell you that they will definitely still be able to get into the EU. Not only do we give you this example of Greenland already being able to do this, but what's the only point that they give you on this topic case is that the EU needs to have unanimous voting. But this is not entirely true. So what ends up happening is when they end up voting here, the EU can censure the voting rights of one nation. And they can do this if, reading from it, it would be enacted when the EU identifies a member persistently breaching the EU's founding values, which is respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. Does that not sound exactly like what Hungary is doing right now? Does that like exactly everything that they say in their speeches? This is exactly the type of behavior that would result in them getting censured in the voting process. So I think for these reasons, you should believe that entirely this Hungary or Poland is going to be removed from this voting process. They'll be censured because of this. This means that the only way they have to this vote not getting through anymore is if they rely on Hungary or Poland's actions. And I have a few the friends of Hungary and Poland to go ahead and like be the person who votes against this. And I have a few responses to this. One, these other countries are unlikely to make these actions because they show them as being sympathetic to horrible beliefs, like being transphobic or being like wanting to hurt the LGBTQ movement, right? So they're unlikely to do stuff like this because that could lead to unrest in their own countries inside like the LGBTQ movements inside their own countries getting mad. And that will also lead to people in other countries being mad at them. That will lead to more conflict, and that will lead to not only other countries inside the EU being mad at them and not wanting to like work with them as nicely and hurting the EU itself, and they'll value the EU because they're members of the EU and they don't want to cause more conflict inside the EU, but that would also hurt them in the eyes of other countries around the world, right? Like the US is increasingly becoming more like willing to be nice to like trans people and trying to work with trans people and all of that stuff. So when a country like tries to support Hungary here and does something that's transphobic, that's going to hurt how they're viewed in the eyes of the US or other countries like this. And because of that, they're not going to want to like try and vote and try and help Hungary here or do anything like that. Sorry, I'm not going to take a POI right now. Like also them, and the most important thing here is them supporting Hungary would violate the rules again, right? So by them supporting Hungary and not wanting LGBTQ people to have the right, so like the rights that they should have, like the human rights here, they should have, like everything that Hungary's doing is breaking respect for human dignity, breaking equality, breaking the respect for human rights, like hurting minorities. It's breaking all of these rules. So them supporting Hungary would break these rules and could potentially lead to them being censored as well. So for all those reasons, you should fundamentally believe that we will be able to get these like peaceful groups to come in. So what's the really important part here now? Sorry, I don't think I'm going to have time for POIs right now. I'll take them probably at the end of the speech. The key thing we're going to end up seeing here now is what are the other types of people who are seceding? Those are the people who are seceding violently. Those are the secessions that you're actually going to end up seeing happening because these secessions are the ones that are going to be happening. Like these secessions are going to be the secessions that end up happening, right? Violent secessions. And what do you end up seeing on our side? Let's go through everything, like each of our contentions now. In our first contention, we tell you about creating more animosity inside the EU. And their really only response to this is there's already some animosity inside of it. okay, while this is true, their side is creating more animosity between it, right? They're creating more divide between everyone inside the EU. Just think about this logically. If you add in a faction of Hungary who used to be Hungarians but now are some other separate faction into the EU, is that not going to break them up into like further break them up into more sects and over who backs up those people and who backs up Hungary? Is not going to cause Hungary to be more like be mad at everyone that they introduce these people and cause Hungary to act out against the EU? Of course, it's going to lead to more animosity. I think we can all agree that more animosity inside the EU is bad because that weakens the EU inside the eyes of everyone in the world, and it'll weaken cooperation between EU countries. Our second contention, we tell you about how this increases violent secessions and how violent secessions are bad because more death. Terrorist states could very easily join the EU here because under their world, again, under the resolution, they need to be successful secessions. What are secessions that are probably most likely to be successful? The ones where people rise up with arms and lead to killing like tons and tons of people because they're shooting them. That's the secessions that are most likely going to be able to be successful. So on their side, you see the successful secessions being able to allow them to join the EU. So let's say someone successfully rises up, probably which they're able to do with guns and able to like shoot a lot of people. Imagine then adding those people into the EU. So you're not only adding terrorists into the EU, but again, this is going to create tons of conflict inside the EU because now you're adding a quote unquote terrorist state into it. All they say is if it's a bad state, they would be revoked. But one, it's hard to leave the EU. It's hard to like kick out these members from the EU. So it's probably going to be hard for them to be revoked at all. But on our side, we're preventing them from being added at all. Imagine just the idea of just adding this terrorist state at all. Like under their side, this terrorist state will be in the EU for some time. And because of that, when they're added into the EU, all of their benefits flow through that they say you could get in the EU, right? So they can more easily travel to other countries. Imagine being able to like being a terrorist and being more easily able to travel to other EU countries. Therefore, it's much easier on their side to like spread more harm to people because these like terrorists can more easily travel. The only response to our third contention is this is a different time. That's not an accurate response. I haven't actually broken down like why the Greenland example wouldn't happen again. This is all they said. It's a different time, so that point largely still stands. But I've told you why these peaceful successions will happen at the top of the case already. Going on to the fourth contention, we say this complicates the Common Security and Defense Pact. All they say is that well, like the EU isn't fundamentally based off like protecting them defensively. But again, what the CSDP says is it involves military or civilian missions being deployed to preserve peace, prevent conflict, and strengthen international security in accordance with the principles of the United Nations Charter. This does not sound exactly what would be happening if there's an uprising inside like an EU country. When they want to try and preserve peace, prevent conflict, and strengthen international security, isn't that exactly what will end up happening here? So this will cause harm because people don't know whether they should comply or not comply with the Common Security and Defense Pact. And then our fifth contention is it's more oppression, as you want to like those will call it more oppression because they'll want to stop them from joining the EU. Because again, under their side, their plan text only works if it's a successful revolution. So they will work really hard here to stop this revolution from being successful. This will lead to more oppression towards LGBTQ people. They don't really give a response to this that really goes through. Another point I really want to touch on right here is this whole landlocked point that they talk about with trading. Because I don't know if I'm going to have time to go through every single part of their thing, but they talk about like the major point that we bring up in response to their whole trading thing is you can trade with China and the US if you're not part of the like EU. This is really good because China and the US have like strong economies and they're good to trade with. The only real response they give to this is, well, you're landlocked, and because you're landlocked, it's going to be really hard to trade with all of these people. Let me name for you tons of other countries that are landlocked and trade with China and the US all the time. South Korea, Malaysia, Vietnam, Belgium, Saudi Arabia, Colombia. All of these countries are landlocked, but yet are able to trade with China and the US all the time. And we tell you that these countries are probably also going to want to trade with China and the US because their like ideas or values could align with them more. Why would they want to trade with someone like people inside the EU when their values don't align with them? But also, it's just better economically to trade with those countries because one, we show that they're able to do it if they're landlocked, but also they have a lot more goods and they're just larger economies, so they can end up helping them more, right? And they're also just largely going to be more sympathetic to them. So their first contention, the like important thing to understand here with that is, again, it's only if it successfully secedes from it. And we tell you that the ones that are most easily going to be able to successfully secede are going to be the violent revolutions. But just, again, we've gone through all their points. And we've told you like the US and China point still stands here. More tourism, like tourism can still exist. You can still go through places and you can still like pretty easily travel between all of these places. And you can still get education from any of these other countries. Like US and China citizens are the biggest tourist boon anyway to most of these countries, and US and Chinese citizens aren't part of the EU, so that tourism point is still going to stand. I've defended the China and US stance here, and education, non-EU members can already attend those schools. So for all those reasons, their impacts already fall here, and we tell you that like secession will more likely happen in our world, and only peaceful successions will exist in our world, while in their world, violent successions will happen a lot more. For all those reasons, I strongly support an opposition ballot. Thank you.
Okay, is everyone ready? Okay, just a quick roadmap on time because I have a lot to get through. I'm going through some quick clarifying points for this round. I may touch on some very
off time, right?
Sorry, yeah, just a quick off time roadmap. Sorry about that. I will be going through some quick clarifying points for this round. I might hit a few points on each case, but then I'm going to finish by weighing. So with that, if everybody is ready. Okay, cool. I'll start my time now. All right, just beginning with some of these clarifying points here. The first question that we brought up, and that's been an essential question for this round, is will a country that's rebelling for a good reason or seceding for a good reason and seceding peacefully be allowed in? The only two responses were given to this as well. Either the voting is unanimous, so the country they seceded from could block them, or the country's friends could block them. As my partner currently told you, the EU allows censorship for anyone who suppresses human rights, who suppresses equal rule of law, who suppresses democracy, which it's very obvious these nations are doing by the examples they've given. So they would be censored, they would lose their voting rights, they would have no say in the vote, so it wouldn't matter if it's unanimous or not, they wouldn't have a say in the vote. Then they said, well, maybe they get their allies to vote with them. But the fact of the matter is, one, this would require some really complicated deal. They haven't given any reason why the other country would be willing to do it, like what they'd be giving. They can't make any economic deal because all the economic rules are set in the EU, so they couldn't make any like trade deal. There's not really anything they could do to help them. It would also damage the country's international relations and the country's image who decided to do that. But most importantly, as my partner told you, by supporting a country who did this and by blocking these this valid and just secession, they would be violating these rules. They would be suppressing minorities. They would be suppressing the fair rule of law. So any nation who's voting against them for any of those reasons, because they were bribed or because they're angry, would be censored, so they wouldn't have a say in the vote. The only reasons to vote no would be they're dangerous, they're terrorists, like the reason we've told you. But if they seceded peacefully with good reason, there's absolutely no reason they'd be blocked, because any nation who tried to vote them down for those reasons would be censored. Also, and I'll get more on this later, even if it's not a guarantee they'll be let into the EU, this isn't the deciding factor in seceding. If you're seceding because you're being suppressed for being an LGBTQ population and because you're being beaten to death, you're not seceding. You're not saying, oh, well, there's this economic issue, maybe it's bad for our economy. That's not the issue. You already know it's going to be bad for your economy. You're breaking up what was a centralized economy. You're losing access to certain things like that. You already know it's going to hurt your economy. They've already accepted it's going to be bad for their economy. The issue is the human rights point. So this economic point will have little to no say in how and whether or not they secede. Going quickly through the points, we told you it increases violent secession. We didn't really hear any response to that. We talked about the Common Security and Defense Pact. They said, well, that doesn't really matter, but my partner gave you good reasons it does. And then finally, we said that it's more likely the secessionists will be oppressed. All they said is they're already oppressed, but as we all know, it can always get worse. They can kill more people. They can crack down harder. They can be more violent. Going through their case very quickly, just hitting some of their central points. On education, we told you non-EU members can be educated in EU schools. There's no issue. They talked about essential goods from other countries and tourism. And as my partner told you, the US and China make up the large majority of this. He gave you a lot of examples of countries who are landlocked who also trade with the US and the EU. And the fact of the matter is, if they're a member of the EU, they're going to have tariffs against the US and China. If they're not a member, they're going to have tariffs against the EU. Either way, they'll have large, strong trading partners. Either way, there'll be tariffs on some. The economic impact is minimal. Now, moving just into weighing this round here, I broke this round up into 4 voter issues: the likelihood of a justified peaceful secession, the likelihood of violent secession, and the benefit to the EU. So in terms of the just peaceful secession, we've explained that it's still very likely these countries would be admitted. We also explained that the fact that this economic issue isn't the deciding factor. They already know it will hurt their economy. They already know there'll be economic negative repercussions, so they don't really care as much about the economy. There's other reasons for seceding, so that's pretty much irrelevant. And lastly, we told you it's actually more likely these people would be suppressed. All they really said is it's bad for the economy, tourism, and education, which we rebutted all of them. So we've basically proven that 1, since the economic issues aren't a big deciding factor, and 2, since it's likely they'll still be let in anyway, and 3, even if they're not let in, it's still fine for their economy, that this would have no impact on the number of just peaceful secessions. But then for violent secessions, like we told you, in our world, they won't be granted members of the EU, and the US and China won't want to trade with them because they were violent. In their world, they'll be let in and they'll still have good trade relations. So it's a lot more likely that there'll be violent secessions in their world because they know they'll have guaranteed trade partners. On the point about the EU, we told told you that there's animosity and we told you that the Common Defense Pact is damaged. They had some slight rebuttals to that, but we counter both of them, so you can agree that it'll be better for the EU in our world. So lastly, we've showed you that we save lives by preventing violent secession. We've showed you that we have an equal number of peaceful secessions. So basically the thing here is both sides have an equal number of peaceful secessions. Both sides have an equal number of just secessions. In their world, there's more violent secession, there's more death, there's more conflict, and it's worse for the EU. So for all these reasons, we very strongly urge a ballot for the opposition, and thank you all for your time.
Okay. Okay, I'll start my time now. I'll be going over 4 voting issues in this round. The first is increasing the probability of secession. We can see that people who are planning on seceding or who want to secede are going to be extremely cautious. If they think that their state doesn't have a good chance of being economically prosperous, if they don't think that their quality of life in their new state will be higher than it is now, they are extremely unlikely to secede, because this is a huge deal. People are extremely cautious. So when they know that there only needs to be 1 vote against them in order to not get a membership, it will look like an extremely high probability to them, whether or not it is, because of the distorted perspective they have due to caution. So this means that under our plan, when they know that they're going to get automatic membership into the EU and get all of those economic benefits.
Stopping time, point of order. I don't think the argumentation that they wouldn't want to risk losing EU membership has been brought up before, but this argumentation that a nation wouldn't know the actual odds of EU membership and might be overly paranoid has never been brought up before in this speech or in this round.
Okay, I think it's just an elaboration on the point that countries seceding are often very cautious. But judges, can you tell me? I don't know. I'm kind of okay. Cool. Anyways, okay. So with a EU membership, countries are more likely to secede. And for some groups of people, this is absolutely essential for their quality of life. So the impacts of a higher chance of seceding and a guaranteed membership into the EU are that these people are going to not be facing human rights abuses. They are not going to be persecuted for their identity, and they will simply have a better quality of life. You should be weighing this point over everything in the round, because we provide a higher probability of seceding, and they don't really increase the probability at all. You can see that these nation states are not likely to secede in the status quo because it is not happening. However, we change something to increase that probability. Under their world, you have no reason to believe that these people are already planning to secede. You have no reason to believe that they will, because there's no evidence in the status quo to indicate that. So our next voting issue is that we prevent stonewalling from Hungary and Poland or other states. You only need 1 vote not to have a country admitted. Hungary and Poland are likely to be that person. They say that you can block 1 nation from voting. However, if Hungary is blocked, Poland will still vote for them, and vice versa. They do this all the time. If neither, for some weird reason, are not able to vote, then they can strike a deal with another country, and this deal is not going to be complicated. Poland can just be like, hey, if you don't vote for this country to be a member of the EU, then we'll vote in favor of you on this issue that you want to get passed. It is pretty simple. It's a vote for a vote. So it is highly, highly likely that either Poland or Hungary will directly intervene in the membership of this state, or they will coerce somebody else into intervening for them. They also their other response to this is that countries won't want to, because they don't want to be shunned by the United States. However, if the United States needs a country or is an ally with a country, they're not going to stop trading with them just because of human rights abuses. We see this in Xinjiang with China. We need China, and therefore we're pretty much overlooking the human rights abuses in Xinjiang, China. So essentially what you can boil this down to is that we need this policy to be passed to ensure that the country is admitted. So we can ensure that the country doesn't collapse and end up giving these people a terrible quality of life overall. Under our plan, we have a higher probability that the seceded state will be a good one that people enjoy living in. Okay, now let's look at 2 of their points. The first is terrorist states are not likely to last in the European Union. First, terrorist states who are not under oppression are very unlikely to secede. It is usually really hard to secede, and it will usually lead to a lower quality of life for the terrorist. It is not in their self-interest, and people who are terrorists are self-interest driven person. It is more in their interest to try to get power in their own country. We also point out that they can kick people can be kicked out of the EU if a country continues to be terrorist. They point out that this is hard. It might be a little bit hard, but it's not impossible. There are previous EU members, as pointed out. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry to PO again, but I feel like the response you're giving to terrorism right now is an entirely new response that they're gonna try to take control inside their own country rather than trying breaking away. I don't think I've ever heard that before.
The kick them out point has come up before, but the point of it's worse for the terrorists, so they'll go for domestic power and not do this hasn't been brought up this whole round. And we brought up terrorism in our first speech.
I'm pretty sure my partner brought up the point that people living in countries that have a high quality of life are unlikely to secede anyway, and that's kind of what I'm saying now, but up to the judge.
Thing is, it's a panel, it'll be taken under consideration.
Cool. Okay, I'm just going to continue. It is hard, but it is not impossible. There are previous EU member states, and if a country is super disruptive, if they are doing all of the terrible things that the opposition proposes that they are doing, then they will be voted out, because it isn't in the self-interest of any of the EU member states to keep them there if they are really that bad. Lastly, oppression and violence are not going to increase. First, I would like to point out that violence is usually the only way for a lot of these marginalized people to secede, because the government is not going to cooperate with a super marginalized group like they did with Greenland. And furthermore, nobody wants to be seceded from. Violence is inevitable usually when it comes to a secession, because Hungary and Poland are going to fight to the nail that this place does not secede, whether or not they have automatic admittance into the EU. We can see this in Ethiopia.
Sorry, not to keep stopping it, but to point of order again, this argument that no rebellions will be peaceful, they'll all be violent. We've been talking about, no secessions. We've been talking about peaceful secession the entire time. And while we've heard argumentation about violent secession, we've never heard this argumentation that peaceful secession will never succeed, so all secession must be violent. Like, we've talked about peaceful secession every round, and this argumentation that peaceful secession is impossible has not come up yet.
Okay, I guess don't take it that it was impossible, but my partner did bring up the point that peaceful secession is highly unlikely to impossible just due to the already in place measures that the government is taking in Hungary and Poland, like cracking down on peaceful protests in a violent manner. So he brought that up already. Okay, so yeah, due to the fact that oppression is not going to increase because of the high stakes of secession already and the human rights abuses that are already occurring, you can basically assume that this is not really likely to happen. The impacts that you are going to be weighing is the quality of life for the marginalized people in Hungary and Poland, and we solve for that. We create a higher quality of life for those people, and that is why you should be voting for the affirmation today. Thank you.
Berkeley? Horace Mann?
Yeah, I'm here.
I see Horace Mann. I see Berkeley. Great. And then Chris, I just want to check, are we still recording RFD? All right, sounds good. So it's a 2-0 decision in favor of the government team. Do you want to go first, Chris, or do you want me to go first? All right, awesome. So one thing I felt like I really needed just in general in this round, like outside of the RFD, like personally, I felt like I really needed a lot more characterization in terms of a lot of different arguments within this round, as well as the framing of the round itself. So from the opposition, I really wanted a lot more characterization on the terrorist organizations / terrorist groups themselves. I really have a hard time analyzing the round in terms of these terrorist organizations, because I don't get a lot of characterizations as to, one, how exactly like they occur, B, how likely, well, two, how likely are they to occur, and like C, like what is their actual tangential impact on like secession movements and how they occur like overall, especially because in like the MG, I do get analysis like, well, I do buy the POO to some extent that like saying that violence is always included. I do get MG analysis saying that more likely to not, there is always going to be some extent of violence potentially. So I do think that there is violence involved in most secession movements. I think intuitively, it also just makes sense that there needs to be some violence included, because like government does articulate that there's always going to be oppression. And I find it really difficult as a judge to kind of be like, oh yeah, Hungary's just going to be like, kumbaya and say, we're just going to let you succeed just freely. So I really wanted a lot more analysis on the organizations themselves and how terrorism actually works. On that note, I also really would have liked a lot more consensus or framing around the EU itself, because I feel like we get a lot of different like analysis of how EU membership actually works. I get this government analysis telling me that, oh, it has to be unanimous, but then I get a lot of analysis from opposition telling me like, oh no, you can censor one government. And the specific articulation I get, like coming right at the top of the opposition, is saying that you can censor one government. But then later on in the opposition, I then hear that, oh no, you can censor multiple governments. And I have a really difficult time figuring out whether it's like only one government as specified at first and articulated at first, or is it multiple governments? Either way, I still end up buying, I think, like the government analysis that, oh, these governments can form blocks with one another, which means that you're still going to have to either censor a lot of people, or in general, it's going to fail and they're not going to gain membership. So yeah, I really needed a lot more characterizations in terms of these different things. Okay, I also wanted a lot more weighing in general. I feel like at the end of this round, I had a lot of floating impacts around that were really good on both sides, but not a lot of like characterization as to where I should place them in terms of like priorities of voting on. I really would have liked it if both the opposition and government had given me more of a comparative analysis, telling me why your side is more unique or more important than the other side, like a best case, worst case scenario type of situation. Because I did find it a little bit difficult to potentially like, I did feel like I needed to intervene a slight bit in trying to like organize some of the impacts on my ballot. Okay, so with that, I ended up asking myself two questions. Which characterization of the EU makes the most sense to me? You're going to see why this is important. I ultimately come up with the analysis that I agree with government that you can probably censor one government as specified by opposition, but it seems very unlikely that you can censor either A, multiple governments, or B, like anyone in this coalition that can be formed. I get a lot of good analysis coming out of the PMR, as well as I think the MG in general tell me that like, okay, yeah, it's true that like you can like, you know, censor one government, but at the end of the day, like you're still going to get blocks forming. You're still going to have people supporting each other like Hungary and Poland. And beyond that, you can form alliance with like other groups that share common minds, specifically like these more like oppressive, like right-wing countries versus like the more liberal countries like Germany, right, happening in the EU. And I get like pretty good analysis out of that. I especially get good analysis in the PMR that refutes the MO, telling me that like, okay, look, people like we still trade with horrible countries no matter what. Like the horribleness is not going to make a difference in whether or not like you support someone or not. Like the US still supports China, even though China is literally engaged in genocide with trade. So there isn't like likely to be a chance that these countries are going to be like, oh no, I don't want to support Hungary because it's going to make me look bad. They're probably just going to say, whatever, if it's good for me to support Hungary because I can get a vote from Hungary in exchange for this vote to like block membership access, I can just do that. So I end up with this characterization where I do agree that like it's very likely that you can probably like censor one country, but it seems unlikely you'll be able to censor a lot of countries. The second question I ask is kind of this characterization of violence. I think that violence to some extent is always probably going to be necessary. The MG did give me some good analysis saying that one, the countries will always strike back against secessionist movements. I also get analysis in like the Prime Minister Constructive telling me that like, oh, look, like in status quo, you're not seeing a lot of people seceding because of like, you know, a lot of roadblocks in general. If what the opposition is telling me is true and you can just secede like whenever really you want and then be accepted into the EU, then I would assume based on this characterization by the government, there's probably going to be a lot more countries seceding. But then this is pulled through in the Prime Minister rebuttal telling me that, look, you're not seeing a lot of countries seceding. This is why, which directly contradicts opposition analysis given to me on like secessions, as well as like this conflict situation that's occurring, right? I think there's also going to not be a significantly marginal increase in violence against oppressed people. I think that MG articulates this really well when they point out that like, oh, look, they're not going to want you to secede, period. Like no country wants to see like a chunk of their people secede, whether or not like they get accepted into the EU is probably irrelevant of that. So this is kind of like where my major issue comes in, like this lack of characterization of terrorist groups. Like what is the likelihood of these terrorist groups actually occurring? What do these organizations look like? How do they function? What role do they play? I feel that if opposition had given me more analysis on this, I would have weighted significantly more. But based on the analysis I get in the round, I don't see a lot of probability as to like these terrorist groups either constituting a giant like influence in the EU. And I do get a check back mechanism from the government telling me like, oh, look, you can kick them out if they are accepted. So like, you know, it might be difficult, but you can kick them out. If they're really terrorist groups, it's probably going to happen, right? So I get this marginal situation where basically I end up weighing potential terrorism versus the potential for a better quality of life against marginalized individuals, based off like what I'm told in the round. And I do end up believing that the potential like for better quality of life for marginalized individuals, based on what I heard, is probably more important and probably is going to have a bigger influence than like some potential terrorist like organizations seceding and then being like a part of the EU. Just because I get a lot of characterization for quality of life of marginalized individuals, but I don't get significant like actual characterization for potential terrorist situations. I hope that RFD makes sense. As I said, I felt it was a little bit messy adjudicating it. I'm sure that Chris is going to explain it a lot better than I can because Chris is just awesome. But yeah, that was my RFD. If you have questions, like please don't hesitate to ask.